Hey everyone, welcome to today's deep dive.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
We're going to be talking about DEI training.
Yeah, specifically, we're going to be looking at the impact of DEI training materials on people's perceptions and biases.
And we've got a lot of research to dive into.
We do. We've got a brand new study from the National Crisis Research Institute, the NCRI.
And some of what they found is really surprising, like challenging assumptions about DEI. So are you ready to get into it?
Absolutely, let's go.
Okay, great. So this NCRI study, what did they do?
Well, they looked at how DEI materials actually affect people, like, their perceptions and biases.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is that they found that some of these materials, instead of reducing bias, might actually be making people more likely to see hostility and discrimination, even when there's no evidence for it.
Wow, so it's kind of doing the opposite of.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what makes this research so interesting.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay, so let's talk about one of the key concepts that emerges from this research, hostile attribution bias.
Yeah, hostile attribution bias, that's when you assume hostility or bias, even when there's no evidence for it.
It's like jumping to conclusions about someone's intentions.
Exactly, and I think we've all probably done that at some point, right?
Yeah, definitely.
You see someone give you a look and you immediately think, oh, they must be thinking something negative about me.
Yeah, or like someone cuts you off in traffic and you automatically assume they're doing it on purpose to be mean.
Right, exactly. But the thing is, most of the time, we don't actually know what's going on in other people's heads, right?
Yeah, we're just making assumptions.
Exactly.
So how does this hostile attribution bias relate to DEI training?
Well, the NCRI researchers found that certain types of DEI training might actually be increasing this tendency to see the worst in others.
Interesting.
Like they're priming people to find problems even where none exist.
So tell me about one of the studies they did. Like, how did they actually study this?
Okay, so in one study, they had college students read either a neutral essay about corn production.
Corn production.
Yeah, just totally random topic.
Yeah, okay.
Or an essay featuring excerpts from the work of Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo on anti-racism.
Okay, so you've got kind of a control group with the corn essay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then they presented the students with a totally neutral scenario about a college application process with no mention of race or ethnicity.
Got it. Okay, so completely neutral situation.
Completely neutral. And what they found was that the students who read the anti-racism essay were significantly more likely to perceive racism in that college application scenario.
More likely to see racism even though there was nothing in the scenario to suggest it.
Exactly. It's like the essay primed them to see racism even where it didn't exist.
That's really striking.
It is, and it raises some really important questions about how the language and framing of certain DEI materials might be impacting people's perceptions.
Yeah, are they actually promoting awareness or are they kind of planting seeds of suspicion and distrust?
That's the big question, right? And to make things even more interesting, they actually replicated this study with a larger national sample and got similar results.
Wow, so it wasn't just a fluke.
It seems like there's something real going on here.
Okay, so they're seeing more racism, but did this actually affect their behavior?
It did. In that same study, they also found that the students who read the anti-racism essay were more likely to support punishing the admissions officer in that hypothetical scenario, even though he had done nothing wrong.
So not only are they seeing bias where it doesn't exist, but they also want to take action against it.
Yeah, it's like they're ready to punish people for things that haven't even happened.
And I mean, it makes you wonder, what are the real-world implications of this?
It's a really important question, right?
Yeah, could this be contributing to things like cancel culture or this pressure to conform to certain viewpoints?
It's definitely something to consider. And this pattern wasn't limited to the study on race and anti-racism. They found similar results when they looked at training materials focused on Islamophobia.
Really? Okay, so tell me about that study. What did they find?
Okay, so for this study, they used content from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, or ISPU, which is a well-known organization promoting awareness of anti-Muslim bias. Again, participants read either the neutral essay or an essay with excerpts from ISPU materials.
So same setup as the first study.
Exactly.
Okay, and then what was the scenario they used this time?
This time, instead of a college application, they presented participants with a scenario involving two fictional people, Ahmed and George, who were convicted of identical crimes.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And the idea was to see if exposure to the anti-Islamophobia material would lead people to perceive bias against Ahmed, even though his case was identical to George's.
And did they find that?
They did. The participants who read the anti-Islamophobia material saw Ahmed's trial as less fair, even though the details of his case were exactly the same as George's.
So again, reading bias into a situation where there's no evidence of it.
Right. And what's particularly concerning about this finding is that this kind of training is sometimes used with federal agents.
Oh, wow.
Like, imagine the potential consequences of that being investigated by someone who's been primed to see you as a threat based solely on your religion.
That's a little unsettling.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
Okay, so we've talked about race, we've talked about religion. Did they look at any other types of DEI training?
They did. They also looked at caste sensitivity training, which is interesting because caste isn't as widely discussed in the U.S. as race or religion.
Yeah, it's getting a lot of attention lately, though, especially in the tech industry.
It is.
Okay, so what did they find in that study?
So for this study, they used materials from Equality Labs, an organization promoting awareness of caste discrimination.
Okay.
And just like in the other studies, participants read either a neutral essay or excerpts from Equality Labs materials.
Same setup. Got it.
Exactly. And for the scenario, they used the college application scenario again, but with absolutely no mention of caste whatsoever.
Okay, so completely neutral.
Completely neutral. And yet those who read the Equality Labs material were more likely to see caste bias in the application process.
Even though there was nothing there to suggest it.
Exactly.
Wow. So it seems like this tendency to see bias and discrimination, even where it doesn't exist, it's a pretty consistent pattern across different types of DEI training materials.
Yeah, that's what the research is suggesting. And in the case of the caste study, they actually found something even more disturbing.
Okay, what's that?
The Equality Labs material didn't just make participants more likely to see bias where there was none. It also made them more likely to endorse negative stereotypes about Hindus in general.
So it wasn't just about seeing bias in a specific situation, but about forming negative opinions about an entire group of people.
Yeah, it's like the training materials were actually creating more prejudice rather than less.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, and it definitely goes against the stated goals of most DEI programs.
For sure. But it seems like this research is pointing to some real concerns about how certain approaches to DEI might be backfiring.
Yeah, and to make things even more interesting, they found a connection between these anti-oppression narratives and a psychological concept called left-wing authoritarianism.
Left-wing authoritarianism.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that term. What is that?
So left-wing authoritarianism, or LWA, is essentially a tendency towards coercive control and intolerance, even when claiming to fight for equality.
So like a kind of ideological purity test.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
And they're saying there's a connection between this mindset and this kind of anti-oppression training.
That's what they found. People who score high in LWA show very similar patterns of thought and behavior as those who are exposed to the DEI materials in these studies. They're more likely to see bias where it doesn't exist. They're more likely to want to punish people for perceived offenses. And they're more likely to endorse really strict social controls.
So you're saying that this kind of DEI training might actually be feeding into authoritarian tendencies?
That's what the research is suggesting.
That's a pretty bold claim.
It is, but the data is pretty compelling. Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder, are these materials actually promoting tolerance and understanding? Or are they creating a more divisive and intolerant climate?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about.
And there's a lot more to unpack here. We've just scratched the surface.
Okay, well, I'm really interested to hear more, so I guess we'll have to continue this conversation next time.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to explore.
Great. Well, thanks for breaking all of this down for us so far.
My pleasure. It's been a fascinating conversation.
So last time we were talking about that NCRI study and some pretty shocking findings.
Yeah, we were looking at how certain types of DEI training materials might actually be increasing bias and hostility.
Right, and it seemed like a pretty consistent pattern across different types of training, like the ones focused on race, anti-Muslim bias, and caste.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting things they found was this connection to left-wing authoritarianism.
Right. LWA.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around that whole concept.
Well, it's basically this tendency towards wanting to control what people say and do, even if it's in the name of social justice.
So like a kind of ideological purity test.
You could say that. And what's really interesting is that the researchers found that people who score high in LWA show similar patterns of thinking to those who were exposed to the DEI training materials.
So like what kinds of patterns?
Well, for example, they're more likely to see bias where it doesn't exist. They're more likely to want to punish people for perceived offenses, and they're more likely to support really strict social controls.
It's almost like the training is reinforcing a particular worldview that sees the world in very black and white terms.
Yeah, you could say that it's like this us versus them mentality, where you have the oppressors and the victims, and the only way to achieve equality is through control and punishment.
That's kind of a scary thought.
It is, but it's important to remember that these findings don't mean that everyone who participates in DEI training is going to become an authoritarian, or that all efforts to promote diversity and inclusion are bad.
Right, of course not.
The goal of DEI is to create a more just and equitable society, which is something I think most people support.
Absolutely. And I think this research does raise some important questions about the methods being used.
Yeah. Like, are they actually achieving the desired outcomes, or are they actually making the problem worse?
Right. Are we actually creating the kind of world we want to live in, or are we inadvertently contributing to a climate of fear and suspicion?
That's a really important question. And the researchers actually propose a model to explain how these anti-oppression narratives can create a kind of self-reinforcing cycle.
Oh, interesting. A cycle that leads to more problems, not fewer.
Exactly. It starts with the DEI training itself, which often presents this very specific narrative about power and oppression.
Dividing people into categories of oppressors and victims based on their identity.
Right. And then as we saw in those experiments, people start to see bias and discrimination everywhere, even when there's no evidence for it.
The hostile attribution bias kicking in.
Exactly. They assume the worst of others based on their group identity.
So it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. The training creates the expectation of bias, and then people start seeing it everywhere.
And then what happens?
Well, this leads to increased suspicion and distrust.
People start to see each other as potential threats.
Right. And they're more likely to interpret neutral actions or words as hostile or aggressive.
It's like this culture of hypervigilance where everyone is on edge waiting for someone to say or do the wrong thing.
Exactly. And then because of this heightened sense of fear and suspicion, people start to call for stricter social controls, more surveillance, harsher punishments.
They want to silence dissenting voices and enforce conformity to this dominant ideology.
And the irony is that this desire for safety and control actually ends up undermining the very values of diversity and inclusion that the training was supposed to promote.
Wow, yeah, that is pretty ironic. So what happens next?
Well, because of this increased focus on policing thought and behavior, there's a demand for even more DEI training.
So it just keeps escalating.
Exactly. It becomes this self-perpetuating cycle. It's like a feedback loop.
So is there any evidence that this cycle is actually playing out in the real world?
I think we can see this dynamic at play in a lot of different areas of society.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the rise of cancel culture, for example.
Oh, yeah, people being publicly shamed and ostracized for expressing views that are deemed unacceptable.
And it doesn't even matter if those views are actually hateful or discriminatory. It's just this assumption of guilt.
And the burden of proof is on the accused to prove their innocence.
Exactly. And I think this is fueled, at least in part, by this narrative that we're constantly bombarded with about power and oppression.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're being trained to see the world in terms of good guys and bad guys.
And anyone who deviates from the approved script is automatically labeled as an enemy.
And this isn't just happening in extreme cases like cancel culture. It's also happening in more subtle ways in our everyday lives.
Like how?
Well, think about how many people are afraid to speak their minds, even in private conversations.
Because they're worried about saying the wrong thing.
Exactly. They don't want to be judged or ostracized.
Yeah, I totally get that. It's like everyone is walking on eggshells, constantly second-guessing themselves.
And this self-censorship can have a really chilling effect on open dialogue and debate.
Which are essential for a healthy democracy.
Exactly. If people are afraid to express their views, then we're all going to be worse off.
It's like we're creating this echo chamber where everyone is afraid to challenge the status quo.
And that can lead to a situation where bad ideas go unchallenged and problems fester because people are too afraid to speak up.
So if we're seeing all these potential downsides to this particular approach to DEI, what are some alternatives?
Well, there are other approaches that focus on things like fostering empathy, building relationships, and creating a culture of open communication and mutual respect.
So less about calling people out and more about calling people in.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have different experiences and perspectives, and that those differences can be a source of strength, not just conflict.
I love that. So it's about fostering genuine connection and understanding rather than just telling people what to think.
And there's research to back this up. Studies have shown that interventions that focus on fostering empathy and perspective taking can actually reduce prejudice and improve intergroup relations.
That makes so much sense because at the end of the day, we're all human
Right,
beings.
with our own unique stories and experiences.
And when we can tap into that shared humanity, it becomes a lot easier to bridge those divides.
Absolutely. And I think another crucial aspect of this more nuanced approach is focusing on commonalities rather than just differences.
Okay, I can see how that might be helpful. But how do we do that in a way that doesn't erase the very real experiences of discrimination that people face?
That's a great question. And it's important to acknowledge that not everyone has had the same opportunities or experiences. But I think it's also important to recognize that we share many fundamental human needs and desires.
Like the desire for connection, for belonging, for respect.
Exactly. Those are things that transcend our differences.
So it's about finding that common ground, that shared humanity, and building from there.
Right. It's about building solidarity around our shared values rather than constantly emphasizing what divides us.
I agree. It's like shifting the narrative from us versus them to we're all in this together.
And that brings us to another really important element of effective DEI, building trust and psychological safety.
Okay, psychological safety. I've heard that term a lot lately. What does it actually mean?
It means creating an environment where people feel comfortable speaking up, sharing their ideas, even making mistakes without fear of being punished or humiliated.
So it's about feeling like you can be yourself without having to constantly worry about saying or doing the wrong thing.
Exactly. And that can be really challenging in today's climate where everyone seems so quick to judge and criticize.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to be perfect or else.
Right. But I think psychological safety is essential if we want to create truly inclusive and equitable spaces.
Because if people don't feel safe to speak their minds, then we're never going to make any real progress.
Exactly. It's like that saying you can't solve a problem that you're not allowed to talk about.
Right. And this requires a shift in leadership, a willingness to embrace discomfort and model vulnerability.
Leaders need to create a space where people feel like they can take risks, where they can learn and grow together, even if it means making some mistakes along the way.
I think that's such a crucial point. It's not enough to just talk about DEI. We need to see it embodied in our leaders.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It needs to be reflected in the way they interact with others, in the culture they create.
And I think this brings us back to that idea of common humanity that we were talking about earlier.
Because when we see each other as fellow human beings with our own strengths and weaknesses, it becomes a lot easier to build trust and empathy.
And that trust and empathy are the foundation for a truly inclusive and equitable society.
Precisely. So if we want to move beyond the limitations of the anti-oppression model and create a more just and harmonious world, I think we need to start by shifting our focus.
Shifting from blame to understanding, from division to connection, from fear to trust.
Exactly. It's a journey, not a destination.
And it starts with each of us with the choices we make every day.
And hopefully this deep dive has given you some new insights and perspectives to consider as you continue on that journey.
Welcome back to our deep dive.
It's great to be back.
We've been talking about DEI training and some of the unintended consequences that the research is pointing to.
Yes, specifically that anti-oppression approach and how it might actually be creating more division and hostility.
Yeah, and even potentially fueling some authoritarian tendencies.
Which is pretty much the opposite of what it's supposed to do.
Right. So where do we go from here?
Well, I think it's important to remember that this isn't about rejecting the whole idea of DEI.
Of course not.
The goal of creating a more just and equitable society is a really important one.
Absolutely. It's just about finding more effective ways to achieve that goal.
Exactly. So let's talk about some alternative approaches.
Okay. What are some of the things that you think hold more promise?
Well, one key shift is moving away from this focus on blame and shame that's so common in the anti-oppression model.
Yeah, it's like instead of trying to make people feel guilty about their privilege or their identity, what if we focused on building understanding and empathy?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have different experiences and perspectives, and that those differences can be a source of strength, not just conflict.
Yeah, and creating a space for open dialogue and learning.
Right. It's about calling people in rather than calling them out.
I love that. It's about fostering genuine connection and understanding rather than just telling people what to think.
And there's actually research to support this approach. Studies have shown that interventions that focus on fostering empathy and perspective-taking can actually reduce prejudice and improve intergroup relations.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, it's about helping people see the world through each other's eyes.
Because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, right?
Exactly. With their own unique stories and experiences.
And when we can tap into that shared humanity, it becomes a lot easier to bridge those divides.
And another crucial aspect of this more nuanced approach is focusing on commonalities rather than just differences.
I can see how that might be helpful. But how do we do that without erasing the very real experiences of discrimination that people face?
That's a great question. And it's important to acknowledge that not everyone has had the same opportunities or experiences.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to recognize that we share many fundamental human needs and desires,
Like what?
like the desire for connection, for belonging, for respect.
Those are things that transcend our differences.
Exactly.
It's about finding that common ground, that shared humanity, and building from there.
Right. It's about building solidarity around our shared values rather than constantly emphasizing what divides us.
It's like shifting the narrative from us versus them to we're all in this together.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important element of effective DEI, building trust and psychological safety.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about psychological safety lately, but can you explain what it means in this context?
Sure. It means creating an environment where people feel comfortable speaking up, sharing their ideas, even making mistakes without fear of being punished or humiliated.
So it's about feeling like you can be yourself without having to constantly worry about saying or doing the wrong thing.
Exactly.
That sounds amazing. But is that even possible in today's climate where everyone seems so quick to judge and criticize?
It's definitely a challenge,
Huh.
but I think it's essential if we want to create truly inclusive and equitable spaces.
Because if people don't feel safe to speak their minds, then we're never going to make any real progress.
Right. It's like that saying you can't solve a problem that you're not allowed to talk about.
And this requires a shift in leadership, a willingness to embrace discomfort and model vulnerability.
Yeah, leaders need to create a space where people feel like they can take risks, where they can learn and grow together, even if it means making some mistakes along the way.
It's not enough to just talk about DEI.
Right. It needs to be reflected in the way leaders interact with others, in the culture they create.
And I think this brings us back to that idea of common humanity.
When we see each other as fellow human beings with our own strengths and weaknesses, it becomes a lot easier to build trust and empathy.
And that trust and empathy are the foundation for a truly inclusive and equitable society.
Exactly. So if we want to move beyond the limitations of the anti-oppression model and create a more just and harmonious world, I think we need to start by shifting our focus.
Shifting from blame to understanding, from division to connection, from fear to trust.
It's a journey, not a destination.
And it starts with each of us, with the choices we make every day.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you some new things to think about as you continue on that journey.
It definitely has for me. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep those minds open and curious.